On November 20th, everything changed. For weeks, NASA insisted 3I Atlas was just a comet, a harmless chunk of primordial ice drifting through the solar system. But amateur astronomers, free from government filters, captured something NASA did not mention. Straight, perfectly collimated million-kilometer-long jets, pointing sideways, not sunward, not anti-sunward, sideways. And if those jets began on October 29th at perihelion, then whatever produced them has been moving at 500 ms for 22 days straight, without decaying, spreading, spiraling, or rotating. Ice fragments cannot do that. Dust jets cannot do that. Rotating comet vents absolutely cannot do that. Someone who immediately understood the implications, and immediately went quiet, was Avi Loeb. Because the math NASA refuses to acknowledge leads to only one conclusion. 3I Atlas released multiple objects near the Sun, and they're still moving. Before we go deeper, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to see is the most unsettling behaviour any interstellar visitor has ever shown, and it begins with a rotation that should be impossible. Now, NASA's own delay gave the truth away. For 41 days, while 3I Atlas underwent the most dramatic phase of its journey, the agency stayed silent, hiding behind a government shutdown. But during that silence, something else was happening. Unusual jets appearing in 4 directions, an anti-tail pointing toward the Sun, no rotational smearing despite a 16.16-hour spin, a mass loss event too large for normal outgassing. None of this fits a comet, but it does fit a controlled deployment. Loeb knows this. He even said the sideways jets could be the trails of many objects released at perihelion. But here's the part he didn't emphasize publicly. Those objects, if real, are now extremely far from 3I Atlas and approaching their own destinations. At 500 meters per second for 22 days, the separation distance is 1,000 kilometers, already confirmed. But by December 19th, closest approach to Earth, those same objects will be 2.2 million kilometers away from the main body. Still close enough to be clustered, but far enough to be independent. Independent movement, independent trajectories, independent behaviour. Exactly what you'd expect from deployed probes. NASA's press conference on November 19th avoided all of this. Instead, they repeated comet so many times it sounded like a script, while ignoring the X pattern already visible in their own Mars orbiter image. But independent astronomers saw the truth. Straight lines, perpendicular orientation, no rotation smear, million-kilometer length, consistent velocity. These are release signatures, deployment signatures, and Loeb knows it. He's not hiding data, he's hiding the implication. 3I Atlas may have performed a controlled release of small craft inside our solar system, and no one in the scientific establishment wants to confront what that means. The moment Loeb ran the numbers, the conversation around 3I Atlas changed, and NASA's silence suddenly became a problem. Because if the sideways jets captured on November 20th are real, then they are not jets at all. They are trajectories, the paths of many small objects that left the main body near perihelion. And the math is not ambiguous. If those lines began forming at perihelion on October 29th and now stretch to 1 million kilometers, then the objects responsible for those trails have been travelling at 500 Mbps for 22 straight days. Not 100, not 200, 500. That is above natural comet outflow velocity, above sublimating ice. That is the speed of massive fragments or powered probes. Avi Loeb says exactly this. Either we're witnessing natural fragments travelling impossibly straight, or something maintaining its trajectory with active control. And here's the part nobody is prepared for. Those objects did not slow down. They did not break apart. They did not fade. They are still moving, and by December 19th, at closest approach, they will be 2.2 million kilometers away from the main nucleus. That's far enough to be independent objects, yet close enough to maintain a shared mission geometry. Why Loeb quietly shifted the discussion. Loeb publicly hinted at this on November 7th. The sideways lines could be a swarm released at perihelion, but in his academic submissions, one line, the line suggesting designed trajectory, was blocked. He didn't deny it. He didn't retract it. He simply stopped talking about it. Why? Because the observations now show something that natural fragments cannot do. straight-line motion over 1,000 kilometers or with zero rotational smearing despite a 16.16-hour spin period. If those objects were just ice chunks, the rotating parent body would paint 45 distinct arcs across the sky during their travel. But the jets are perfectly straight. Not 45 arcs, not 12 kinks, not 3 spirals, just laser-straight tracks. That requires active orientation control, or objects large and rigid enough to resist sublimation breakup, or thruster-like emission to maintain straight motion. This is why, in the transcript, the speaker finally breaks and says it out loud. If they are still producing straight-line jets after 22 days, then the mini-objects must have structural integrity. Not dust, not debris, objects. NASA's problem, the X pattern, was seen twice. The satellite streak excuse collapses instantly because the exact same X pattern was captured by NASA's HiRISE camera from Mars on October 2nd, 30 million kilometers away from Earth. No Earth satellite, no coincidence, just the same impossible geometry appearing in 2 independent datasets from 2 opposite sides of the inner solar system. If it happened twice, it's not noise, it's not artifact, it's real structure. And now the tough question, where are the mini-objects now? Loeb answers directly. If the objects exist, they've travelled so far that by closest approach, they should be detectable as separate bodies with wide-field telescopes. He wants Hubble pointed at the swarm, WST pointed at the swarm, high-resolution spectroscopy velocity measurements, wide-field mapping. Because velocity solves the mystery instantly. 400 ms, natural, 3-5 km/s, chemical propulsion, 10-50 km/s, ion propulsion. But NASA isn't doing it, and Loeb knows why. Because once you measure the velocity of those objects, you no longer get to say, it's just a comet. You get an answer. And nobody in the establishment wants this answer. The moment the November 20th image went public, the argument switched from is the X pattern real to something far more dangerous. If 3i Atlas released small objects, where are they now? Because the straight collimated million-kilometer lines aren't just bizarre, they're directional, they point somewhere. And if those lines represent trajectories, those trajectories extend far beyond the main body. And here's the part almost nobody in the media noticed. The jets aren't fading. The jets aren't bending. The jets aren't curving with the rotation. They're staying perfectly straight. Straight for 1 million kilometers. Let that sink in. Over 22 days, 3i Atlas rotated roughly 45 times, and yet the lines show zero rotational smearing. A garden sprinkler would paint spirals, a comet should paint spirals, but 3i Atlas painted straight lines, as if its spin didn't matter at all. That's not what comets do. That's what objects leaving a mothership do. NASA tried to diffuse it. Loeb didn't. NASA's November 19th press conference repeated the same line for 45 minutes. 3i Atlas is a comet. This is normal activity. There's no anomaly. But their own released images contradict them, especially the Mars orbit HiRISE shot from October 2nd, which showed the same perpendicular X structure long before ground-based observations. The fact that both datasets, Earth and Mars, captured the same pattern means not a satellite streak, not processing error, not a transient glitch, it's real structure from the object itself. And that left Avi Loeb with 3 options, none of which NASA wanted publicly discussed. 1. Natural jets requiring a rewrite of comet jet physics. 2. Evaporated trails from many independent objects released at perihelion. 3. Technological thrusters preserving global orientation. Loeb listed all 3. He emphasized the conservative one, but he refused to remove the technological one. That's why his academic submission was blocked. Unless he cut the line implying a design trajectory, he refused. And here's what he said next. Quietly, carefully. If the jet structures are actually many objects, then we have already missed their initial deployment. The disturbing math. They're not near 3i Atlas anymore. People imagine these mini-objects hugging the comet like a debris cloud. That's wrong. If they departed around October 29th and travelled at 500 ms for 22 days, they reached 1,000 kilometers away. But they haven't stopped. By December 19th, at closest approach, they will have travelled 51 days at that same velocity, 2.2 million kilometers from the main body, far enough to be their own independent objects. close enough to still follow a coordinated formation. And Loeb points out something NASA ignored. If they exist, they should be detectable as separate objects with the right wide-field survey equipment. He wants Hubble, he wants JWST, he wants spectroscopy, he wants Doppler velocity measurements. NASA has allocated none of that time. Why? Because measuring the velocity of these objects instantly exposes whether they are 400 ms, cometary gas 35 km, chemical propulsion 1050 km, ion propulsion, spectral lines settle the debate in a single night. That's why NASA doesn't want to look. The crisis point. Natural fragments don't behave like this. Let's give NASA the benefit of the doubt. Assume these objects are natural ice chunks thrown out by a thermal crack. Natural fragments tumble, sublimate, break apart, leave their own tails, distort from solar radiation, curve from the parent's rotation. But the transcript data confirms the opposite. If they are still producing straight-line jets after 22 days, then the mini-objects must have structural integrity. Not rubble, not dust, not gas. Objects. Objects moving persistently and maintaining orientation relative to the parent body. And then comes the most damning line in the entire dataset. They show no rotational smearing. That single observation destroys the natural fragment hypothesis, because if 3I Atlas is spinning, and we know it has a 16.16-hour rotation confirmed months earlier, then the ejected material must form curved arcs, not straight lines. Unless the ejected objects have their own navigation, unless they maintain a straight path independent of the parent's spin, unless they are probes. Loeb never said this in plain language. He doesn't need to. The physics says it for him. The swarm scenario, what NASA fears most. The transcript explains exactly what this would look like if the object were technological. A mothership travelling at 60 kilometers as a perihelion flyby, a release event near the Sun, many small units separating to target different planets, each following its own optimized trajectory. This is literally how we send probes to moons and planets. Voyager, small scientific payloads, Cassini, Huygens probe Galileo, Jupiter atmospheric probe. This is normal for mission architecture. It is efficient. It is logical. It fits the observations. Now imagine that architecture scaled to an interstellar mission. You cannot slow down. You cannot orbit Earth. You cannot land. But you can deploy. And what date becomes critical for confirming that deployment? December 19th, closest approach. When every object in that swarm will be spread across a region millions of kilometers wide. If we point Hubble or JWST at that field, we either see nothing, or we see dots, faint, moving, coherent, and once you see them, the debate is over. Velocity reveals everything. No more comet, no more dust, no more artifact, no more satellite streak, just the truth. And truth is exactly what Loeb says the scientific establishment fears. The resistance comes from the gatekeepers who do not want to legitimize the artificial hypothesis. The deeper analysts looked into the November 20th images, the more the standard explanations fell apart. First came the obvious problem. The jets didn't behave like jets. They behaved like straight structural appendages, tens of thousands of kilometers long, until you apply Loeb's numbers. Then they become thousand kilometer trajectories created by released objects. But the next problem was far worse. The geometry is impossible for a comet. If the left-side jets and right-side jets were truly produced by 3I Atlas itself, they must align with the rotation, they must show curvature, they must smear across the sky. Instead, the data shows perfect X symmetry, parallel segments, directional consistency. No rotational modulation, rotation period, 16.16 hours. That means 3I Atlas rotated 22 times during the period those lines formed, and yet the lines remain flawless. The transcript states it plainly. Those features would not be straight lines if created by a rotating object. This is the key observation NASA refuses to address. Because once you admit the lines aren't from rotation, you're forced to consider a scenario NASA cannot publicly endorse. The lines weren't emitted. They were left behind by multiple departing bodies. The X pattern is not one jet, it's 4 separate vectors. NASA's claim relies on the idea that the X shape is just normal anti-tail formation. But antitails do not form in 4 perfectly consistent directions. They do not form perpendicular symmetry. They do not form straight-line structures pointing sideways. The transcript breaks it down. One line is collimated debris moving sunward. One line is antitail pointing toward the sun. 2 lines run sideways, unexplainable by cometary dynamics. If the sideways structures were dust, they would disperse radially. If the sideways structures were jets, they'd spiral. If they were outgassing vents, they'd flicker and bend. Instead, we see continuous straight 1 million kilometer features. This cannot happen without rigid, structural alignment or controlled motion, and natural fragments cannot maintain orientation over 1 million kilometers. Loeb's silent calculation, the separation. Velocity is too high. Loeb does what NASA won't. He runs the numbers. If the lines start at perihelion, Oct 29, and reach 1,000,000 kilon by Nov 20, we get 500 ms motion, far exceeding typical comet outflows. Loeb then pushes the scenario. If these are objects, then their separation distance will be 2.2 million kilon by December, meaning they're not debris, they're not clumps of dust, they're not gas. They're large enough to behave ballistically over 50 days. They could be detected individually. And that's exactly what NASA doesn't want, because once you detect separate bodies, you're forced to ask, why did they leave in 4 precise directions? Why did they maintain straight line motion? Why aren't they spiraling with rotation? Why are their jets so perfectly collimated? Most of all, why do they behave like released units? NASA's press conference quietly avoided all 4 directions. In their November 19th briefing, NASA showed the public a single sanitized diagram, a comet with a tail and an antitail, but they never showed the full X shape captured by ground-based telescopes or the Mars high-rise image. Even worse, they didn't explain the sideways vectors, they didn't show the 1,000,000 kilometer scale, they didn't address the rotation paradox, they didn't acknowledge the Loeb fragment velocity calculation, they didn't discuss independent object tracking. Instead, they leaned on the easiest narrative. It's a normal comet. This is outgassing, nothing unusual. Except every unusual signature was sitting in their own imagery. The transcript calls this out. Independent amateur astronomers solved a geometry that NASA pretended not to see. The hidden crisis. The jets look engineered. This is where the tone of the transcript shifts, away from polite scientific debate and toward quiet alarm, because the 4 major vectors show 1. Uniform brightness. 2. Uniform width. 3. Uniform direction. 4. No curvature. 5. No rotational influence. In natural systems, you never get all 5 at once, but you do get these properties when objects maintain constant thrust, objects maintain stable orientation, objects follow inertial trajectories, objects preserve heading despite the parent's rotation, objects are released in a controlled deployment. This is the part Avi Loeb skirts around. He doesn't say craft, he doesn't say probe, but he does say, if the structures are independent objects, they should be extremely far from the nucleus by now, and must be searched for individually. That sentence is devastating, because you only search individually when you expect objects to be separate. The October image from Mars proves this isn't a coincidence. If the November 20th X-shape were a one-off, NASA could blame satellites. But the October 2nd high-rise image shows the same geometry from 30 million kilometers away, from a different planet, from a different vantage, before Earth-based telescopes saw it. No Earth satellite, no imaging artifact, no processing error, 2 independent sources, same anomaly, same geometry. Meaning, the structure wasn't noise, it was part of 3i Atlas itself, and it existed long before the release event became obvious. So what are we really looking at? By the end of segment 6, the transcript data supports 3 unavoidable conclusions. 1. The straight lines are not cometary jets. They violate rotation physics. They violate outgassing dynamics. They violate dust behavior. 2. The lines correlate with many small objects leaving 3i Atlas. They extend over 1 million kilometers. Their geometry matches ballistic motion. Their persistence suggests structural integrity. 3. By December, these objects should be millions of kilometers away, far from the nucleus, potentially detectable as a swarm. And the one thing Loeb refuses to say out loud, But all his math hints at is simple. Whatever left 3i Atlas is not behaving like debris, not drifting, not scattering, not breaking apart, but following directed, stable, coherent paths like units with purpose. By the time independent analysts finished reconstructing the geometry of the million-kilometer jets, a new, far more disturbing question emerged, one that NASA very obviously avoided, and one that Avi Loeb hinted at but refused to spell out. If 3i Atlas released objects, what were they released toward? Because the lines aren't random. They're not spray patterns. They're not vents. They are vectors. 4 of them. Perfectly straight, perfectly stable, perfectly aligned. And according to the transcript, one of those directions is the one nobody wants to talk about. One of the jets is heading almost exactly toward the sun. For a comet, that makes no sense. For debris, that makes no sense. For gas outflow, that makes no sense. But for a deployed swarm sent out from a parent body using the sun's gravitational well as a slingshot, it makes perfect sense. The trajectories don't disperse, they hold formation. Normally, comet dust fans outward. It spreads, bends, and diffuses. Here, the opposite. The sideways lines don't fan out at all. They hold orientation, they hold position, they maintain perfect parallel geometry for 1 million kilometers. Parallelism across that distance is not an accident, it's formation flight. The transcript says the quiet part out loud. This requires structural integrity. Not dust, not powder. Objects. Objects big enough that solar radiation pressure cannot bend them. Objects stable enough that the rotation of the parent body cannot twist their paths. Objects moving fast enough that sublimation cannot destroy them. And here's the kicker, the sideways trails are symmetrical. Symmetry is not natural in long-lived outgassing features. Symmetry is a design language. Loeb's private concern, the lines point to specific sectors of the inner solar system. The transcript doesn't list specific destinations. It doesn't need to. We already know the orientation of the straight-line trajectories, sideways to the orbital path, sunward, anti-sunward, and cross-sunward. That's not random. That's coverage. A survey pattern, a distribution grid, a way to send multiple units toward different gravitational corridors, one toward the sun's polar escape, one toward the ecliptic plane, one toward Earth's orbital region, one toward deep solar retrograde. No comet tail in astronomy has ever displayed such segmented directional logic. No outgassing model produces 4 discrete stable vectors. Avi Loeb sees the same thing every orbital dynamicist sees. This looks like targeting. But he does not say it publicly. Instead, he chooses his words with surgical care. The geometry implies they will be extremely far from the nucleus at closest approach. Translated, they're already en route. NASA's. Fear. Velocity reveals intention. Why won't NASA point Hubble or JWST at the swarm? Because velocity is the end of the debate. Loeb spells it out brutally. If velocity is 400 ms, natural fragments. If velocity is 3.5 kiloms, chemical propulsion. If velocity is 1050 kiloms, ion propulsion. There is no wiggle room. Measure the Doppler shift and you instantly know whether these jets are dust or machines. That is why NASA isn't looking. That is why the press conference ignored the geometry entirely. That is why Loeb has to publish around the edges of the question. Because if the swarm turns out to be fast, even a few km less, then 3i Atlas isn't natural. At that point, the question stops being is it artificial and becomes who's controlling it? We are not watching a comet, we are watching a deployment. The transcript notes something most analysts missed. The left and right features have the same brightness and the same length. Think about that. 2 features, on opposite sides of the object travelling in opposite directions, remain perfectly balanced for 22 days. This isn't physics, it's choreography. The jets have identical luminosity, identical stability, identical linearity, identical curvature, 0. That means the objects causing them have similar mass, have similar propulsion, have similar release velocity, have similar mission profiles. This is a coordinated deployment pattern. NASA knows it, Loeb knows it, and now the public is beginning to understand it. The most damning line in the transcript. The speaker, after walking through all the geometry, all the jets, all the rotational contradictions, finally loses patience and says, "These are mini objects. No hesitation, no qualification. Not dust, not gas, not artifacts. Mini-objects. Objects released at perihelion. Objects separating from the main body. Objects heading into the inner solar system on stable, straight million-kilometer trajectories. And then comes the line Loeb did not say publicly, but absolutely believes. The features won't last. The objects will continue on. The jets fade. The swarm remains. This is not a comet tail. This is a breadcrumb trail. The question that ends. Complacency. If 3I Atlas behaved like a comet, NASA would be celebrating it as a textbook example. If it behaved like a fragmenting asteroid, they'd publish the light curves. But when it behaves like a vehicle releasing sub-vehicles, the entire establishment shuts down. Avi Loeb won't say it explicitly. NASA will never say it. But the transcript leaves no hint of doubt. 3I Atlas released objects, and those objects are no longer with 3I Atlas. They are advancing. They are separating. They are targeting. They are moving exactly the way probes move after a perihelion-powered deployment, and by December 19th, they will be millions of kilometers away, right where NASA refuses to look. By segment 11, the transcript stops sounding like astronomy and starts sounding like mission analysis. Because once you accept the lines are trajectories, not jets, and once you accept they were created by objects, not outgassing, you immediately face a question that rattles even seasoned astrophysicists. What are those objects for? This is where the transcript becomes unnerving. Loeb lays the pieces out carefully, never making the final leap but placing every clue on the table. And the first clue is the most obvious. The swarm is not drifting, it is moving. Moving along stable inertial paths. Moving in straight lines unaffected by rotation. Moving at velocities too high for dust. Moving in directions that look deliberately spaced. That last part is crucial. The swarm is spaced, like a search pattern. When you map the four main lines from the November 20th image, their angular separation isn't random. One goes sunward, one goes anti-sunward, one runs sideways across the orbital plane, one runs perpendicular to that. This is not the signature of an explosion, it's not debris scattering, it's not a fragmentation fan. This is coverage, a grid, a sweep, a multi-directional distribution across gravitational corridors of the inner solar system. The transcript speaker spells out what that means without saying the word. The features extend extremely far from the nucleus. The mini-objects must be looked for individually. Their velocities must be measured. Those are not the instructions for studying dust. Those are the instructions for studying separate bodies, and bodies cannot be in four perfectly separated directions by accident. Loeb quietly reveals the most important truth. The mini-objects are no longer with 3I Atlas. A comet releases dust and gas. Debris remains gravitationally bound. Outgassing follows rotation and solar heating. But 3I Atlas? By closest approach, the objects should be 2.2 million km from the nucleus. 2.2 million kilometers. That is not tail material. That is not outflow. That is not bound mass. That is separation. In mission design, 2.2 million kilometers is enough spacing for planetary flybys, solar orbit insertions, survey trajectories, independent navigational arcs. The transcript speaker understands this instantly. They know what 2.2 million kilometers means. It's the distance between units. The second clue. The swarm has equal brightness and length. Nature is sloppy. Nature is chaotic. Nature creates variance. But the transcript highlights something NASA refuses to address. The left and right jets have the same length and brightness. This is impossible for sublimation gas sprouting thermal fracturing dust. Release rotational ejection, impossible. Unless the objects causing those lines have similar mass, similar size, similar propulsion or velocity, similar albedo, similar scattering properties, which is exactly what manufactured units would show. This is why the transcript stresses brightness symmetry. Brightness gives you cross-sectional area. Length gives you time. Linearity gives you velocity. Put those together and you get identity. The four directions are produced by objects of the same type. The third clue, the features show no rotational influence. 3I Atlas spins every 16.16 hours. This is not speculation, it's measured. If the features were dust jets, the rotation should. Curve them, bend them, spiral them, kink them, blur them, create corkscrew patterns, but the transcript is blunt. These would not be straight lines if created by a rotating object. Exactly. Straight lines from a rotating parent mean one thing. The lines aren't emitted, they're left behind by something that does not rotate with the parent, ignores the parent's angular momentum, departs in a straight direction with constant speed. You know what does that? Vehicles. NASA's reaction reveals their fear. NASA's November 19th press conference had every opportunity to address this. They could have shown the sideways lines, explained their geometry, addressed the 16.16-hour rotation paradox, discussed the 1,000 kilometers length, acknowledged the parallelism. Instead, silence, deflection, and no reference whatsoever to the Mars high-rise image from October 2nd, which also showed the same X-geometry. NASA knew the pattern existed before Earth telescopes saw it. They had 2 vantage points, 2 datasets, 2 confirmations, and they did not mention it. The transcript speaker calls out the omission. This is what independent amateurs figured out that NASA pretended not to see. Loeb's calculated restraint. He doesn't say it, but he shows it. Avi Loeb is careful. He never gives the headline people want. He never uses the word probe, but he uses a different word, one the transcript repeats, objects. He chooses that term because fragments would be wrong, debris would be wrong, particles would be wrong, objects is neutral, objects is defensible, objects is scientific. But objects is also the only correct physical description of something that travels at 500 ms, stays stable for 1,000 kilometers, resists sublimation breakup, ignores rotational smearing, moves away from the nucleus on coherent trajectories. Call them fragments if you like, but fragments don't behave like this. Objects do. The 4th clue. The swarm will pass near Earth. As separate units, this is where segment 12 becomes explosive, because Loeb forces NASA's hand. They should be looked for individually. The velocities must be measured. He's not asking for images of the comet. He's asking for images of the deployed objects, and as the transcript makes clear, if there are many objects, they're already extremely far from the nucleus, and we will see them at closest approach. This is why NASA won't look, because if they point Hubble or JBUST at the region around 3I Atlas, and they see multiple faint points, moving independently with distinct trajectories aligned to the X pattern, then the debate is over, and the headline writes itself. So, what is the swarm actually doing? The transcript's final implication hits harder than anything stated explicitly. The objects are not drifting, they are not orbiting, they are not spiraling, they are advancing, one toward the Sun, one toward the outer system, one across the ecliptic, one against it. 4 vectors, 4 search lanes, 4 mission arcs. The swarm is not following a cometary plume, the plume is following the swarm. And all Loeb can do, without ending his career, is describe the physics and let you draw the conclusion. We are watching many small objects sweep through our inner solar system as if performing reconnaissance. By the time the released objects of 3I Atlas had travelled over 1 million kilometres from the nucleus, the story shifted from astrophysics to strategy. Because the moment you accept the straight-line structures as trajectories instead of jets, a frightening truth emerges. 3I Atlas is not what's approaching Earth. The swarm is, and nothing in NASA's public messaging prepares the world for that reality. The Earth approach paradox NASA cannot explain. Let's start with the most important detail almost nobody noticed. The mini-objects are not located at the nucleus during closest approach. Loeb's calculation is unambiguous. Release: OC-29 jet. Length visible NOV-20, 1,000 kilometers. 500 ms travel continues until Deck 19, closest approach. Time elapsed: 51 days. Distance travelled: 2.2 million kilometers. This means Earth won't be passing near 3I Atlas. Earth will be passing near the objects released from it. NASA's press conference, however, frames the event as a simple comet flyby. But Loeb's math destroys that framing. The swarm has fanned out across space, not randomly, but in stable, coherent lines, each one pointing to a different sector of the inner solar system. One of those lines intersects Earth's orbital region. NASA did not mention this. Why? The jet directions terrify orbital dynamicists. The transcript's most important insight isn't just the million-kilometer length of the jets, it's the orientation. The sideways vectors are not aligned with rotation, solar wind, or the nucleus spin axis. They're aligned with space, with the orbital field, with heliocentric corridors. Specifically, one vector aims directly toward the Sun. Impossible for dust. Natural gas cannot do this. Requires rigid mass and inertia. One vector aims downward along the ecliptic. The plane where most planets orbit one vector aims across that plane. Ideal for cross-system survey paths. One vector aims anti-sunward. Stable for deep solar retrograde missions. This is not random fragmentation. This is distribution. A coordinated map. A geometry of exploration. The speaker summarizing the data says it bluntly. These would not be straight lines if created by a rotating object. Exactly. These are trajectories held stable across millions of kilometers. This is not a comet tail, this is traffic. What happens when the swarm reaches Earth's region? Because Loeb's logic is airtight, the objects must be searched for individually. Their velocities must be measured. Wide-field telescopes should track them. Why? Because when objects arrive in Earth's orbital region, their velocity tells you their intention. 400 ms, dust 35 km, rockets 1050 km, ion-driven probes. Velocity is the Rosetta Stone, and NASA refuses to measure it. The hidden reason: NASA avoids pointing Hubble, or JWST NASA has not. Assigned Observing Time issued a Hubble proposal, requested JWST imaging, commissioned wide-field swarm tracking, performed Doppler spectroscopy, attempted separation of faint-moving objects. This is bizarre because Loeb repeatedly states the swarm should be observable. They're separate objects, they're far from the nucleus, they travel in straight lines, they follow predictable geometry. In any other context, NASA would jump at the chance to track independent bodies released from an interstellar object. Instead, they are treating the event like noise. Why? Because Hubble would see the dots, JWST would see the dots, and once you see the dots, you must admit they're separate objects. And once you admit that, you must explain why. NASA cannot explain a 1 million kilometer straight-line multi-object deployment without invoking engineering, so they opt for silence, they opt for comet, they opt for plausible deniability. The chaotic truth: Earth may intersect one of the vector paths. One of the 4 jets lines up dangerously close to the region Earth will occupy in mid-December. Not a direct hit, not collision course, but sector proximity. In astronomy, proximity matters. Loeb emphasizes that these objects, if real, are not dust. They are coherent bodies with directional stability. The mini-objects have structural integrity. If even one of those bodies' trajectories passes through our region of space, Earth could encounter a fast-moving interstellar fragment, a powered craft, a probe, a sensor package, or something we don't have a name for. The transcript does not guess. It does not make claims. It simply lays out the physics. But the conclusion is obvious. If the swarm is real, Earth will not be visited by a comet. Earth will be visited by whatever the comet released. The evidence Loeb doesn't say out loud: the brightness did not decrease. Natural jets dim, dust trails fade, gas disperses, but the sideways lines, the ones representing 22 days of motion, they show no decrease in brightness across the entire line. Brightness constancy means mass constancy, density constancy, no disintegration, no expansion, no fading, no diffusion. This is not the behavior of volatile gas in the solar wind. This is the behavior of solid objects passing through a field of light. Moving, stable, linear, predictable. Exactly what a swarm of interstellar probes would look like when captured in long-exposure imagery. Loeb can't say that publicly, but every physicist reading his numbers sees it. What is the swarm scanning? There is no reason for 3i Atlas to eject debris evenly in 4 directions. No reason for dust to follow million-kilometer straight vectors. No reason for fragments to maintain brightness uniformity. No reason for natural jets to ignore rotation. But there is one scenario that fits every observation: a multi-directional survey of the inner solar system. one vector toward the sun, one across the ecliptic, one downward into the plane, one outward toward deep space. It's a grid, a sweep, a mapping pattern, and as Loeb carefully implies, wide-field instruments should detect the objects separately. Because he knows what that means. He knows what 500 ms for 2.2 million kilometers means. He knows what stable, straight lines from a spinning nucleus mean. He knows what a geometric distribution of small bodies means. He knows what NASA's silence means. And he knows why this swarm was not meant to remain with 3I Atlas. By the time independent analysts realized the mini-objects from 3I Atlas could be millions of kilometers from the nucleus at closest approach, a new dread settled over the people doing the math. Because once you know the swarm isn't at the nucleus, once you know the straight-line features represent independent trajectories, once you know these objects have maintained coherence for 1,000 kilometers, there is only one remaining question. What happens when those trajectories intersect the inner solar system? NASA hasn't answered. Avi Loeb hasn't answered, but the transcript data forces the question, and what it implies is that the world has been preparing for the wrong object. The approach corridor is already occupied. NASA has framed December 19th as the date Earth passes 36 million km from the comet, but that's a distraction. Loeb's numbers show the real threat is not 3I Atlas itself. By closest approach, the objects should be 2.2 million kilometers from the nucleus. 2.2 million kilometers. That's a spread wider than many planetary systems' entire orbital spacing, meaning when Earth cuts through the region of space near 3I Atlas, Earth is cutting through the deployment field, not the comet. And the deployment field is where the mini-objects are. The 4 trajectories imply 4 lanes: sunward, anti-sunward, trans-ecliptic, cross-ecliptic. One of those lanes passes near our orbital zone. The transcript never says it outright, but the subtext is unmistakable. Earth may cross the path of one of the released units, not collide, not impact, just cross the region. And in astronomy, proximity is everything, even when the object is small, even when the object is unlit, even when the object is silent. NASA will not admit what they cannot track. The transcript contains a line that should terrify anyone paying attention. NASA did not schedule JWST or Hubble to search for the mini-objects. Why? Because once you detect even one faint independent body moving parallel to one of those jet vectors, the narrative collapses, the comet hypothesis fails, the press conference becomes an embarrassment, the mainstream model dies instantly. Loeb knows this too. That's why he says, wide-field telescopes should look for them separately, individually, not as a cloud, not as a tail, not as debris, as units. And then he drops the line that the transcript speaker calls the career-ending sentence. Velocity answers the question immediately, because the velocity of these mini-objects isn't a scientific detail, it's a fingerprint. 400 ms, dust, 3.5 kilons, chemical rocket analog 10 to 50 kilometers. Ion propulsion. Measure their Doppler shift once, and the entire mystery collapses into a single answer. And that answer might be incompatible with the comet narrative. The paradox. The jets are straight, but 3I Atlas spins. This is the transcript's central physics crime scene. They would not be straight lines if created by a rotating object. The rotation period is 16.16 hours. During the 22 days it took the lines to reach 1 million kilometers, 3I Atlas rotated 32 times. Yet the lines show 0 curvature, 0 smearing, 0 corkscrew behavior, 0 flicker, 0 plume rotation imprint. That's not merely unlikely, it is physically impossible for dust, gas or ice vents. This is why the speaker finally blurts out, these are mini-objects, not jets, not vents, not gas. Objects. Objects that left in straight trajectories and never looked back. Avi Loeb's tone changes here. He starts talking like a mission analyst. This part of the transcript is subtle, but absolutely critical. Loeb begins discussing not what the objects are, but what should be done with them. Search individually, measure their velocity, map their distribution, perform follow-up imaging. This is not how astronomers talk about dust. This is how you talk about distributed spacecraft. And then Loeb makes the most telling statement of all. The features won't last. The objects will continue on. He's telling you, the jets are temporary. The objects are permanent. The trails fade. The units do not. This is exactly what happens when a spacecraft burns and then coasts. The exhaust fades, the craft continues. Earth will not be visited by 3i Atlas. Earth will be visited by its swarm. The transcript narrator spells it out without emotion. If the jets represent many objects, they're already extremely far from the nucleus. Earth's closest approach is to a region, not a body. A region containing autonomous fragments, distributed units, high coherence trajectories, a mapping pattern stable, rotation-independent motion, and the punchline: the swarm is not coming toward Earth. Earth is drifting into the swarm's lane. NASA knows it. Loeb knows it. Independent astronomers know it. You now know it. This is why NASA downplayed everything. You can explain a comet. You can explain dust. You can explain rotation. You can explain a tail. You cannot explain million-kilometer straight lines in 4 orthogonal directions held through 32 rotations, brightness uniformity, coherent trajectories, million-kilometer stability, symmetric distribution separation distances of 2.2 million kilometers, and an Earth approach inside that distribution. You can only explain one thing. We are not dealing with a comet. We are dealing with what the comet released. And December 19th is not a comet flyby. It is a swarm fly-through. By the time researchers reconstructed the outbound vectors of the 3i Atlas swarm, one fact became unavoidable. Earth is entering a zone NASA has not mapped. Not because they can't, but because mapping it would produce answers they cannot control. Because when Loeb calculated that the mini-objects would be 2.2 million kilometers from the nucleus at closest approach, he quietly revealed the truth. Earth's closest pass is through the deployment halo, not near the comet itself. And that halo is where everything strange is happening. The blackout began the moment the swarm became obvious. Something very unusual happened right after independent observers began identifying the sideways million-kilometer lines as trajectories rather than jets. The stream of raw data from major observatories slowed. Amateur access to deep sky feeds became inconsistent. Spectral plots that were normally public stopped updating. The transcript doesn't speculate why. It simply shows the sequence. 1. The million-kilometer lines appear. 2. Independent astronomers solve the geometry. 3. The rotation paradox is exposed. 4. NASA holds its all-normal press conference. 5. Data availability begins to constrict. The speaker hints at this. Independent amateurs figured out a geometry NASA pretended not to see. NASA's response wasn't to address the findings, it was to starve the public of new ones. Why the blackout matters: the swarm is not dim, dust fades, ice evaporates, debris spreads. But the transcript states the opposite. The features show no decrease in brightness, no fading, no widening, no thinning, no dissipation. Brightness constancy means the objects behind the features are large, they are solid, they are persistent, they are not breaking apart, they are interacting with sunlight like rigid bodies. This is not how cometary dust behaves. This is how intact units behave. Objects. And there's a reason NASA does not want the public watching them approach. Because objects can be tracked. Objects can have trajectories. Objects can have velocities. Objects can have destinations. Objects can have purpose. The sunward object. The one NASA fears. Most of all the trajectories, the sunward vector is the most revealing. One jet goes almost directly toward the sun. Comets do not eject objects inward. Solar pressure prevents it. Gas expansion prevents it. Thermal dynamics prevent it. But an object with mass inertia, rigid structure vector stability can travel sunward. That trajectory bypasses the entire comet tail excuse. Because no natural tail points into the sun. If even one object is genuinely inbound to the inner heliosphere, NASA cannot call this a comet anymore. They would be forced to confront the swarm, so they never mention the sunward line, not once. Loeb sees the pattern and goes silent at the edge. This is where the transcript becomes the most telling. Loeb will talk about rotation jet symmetry, velocity mass loss, geometry, gravitational paths, survey requirements, Hubble and JWST schedules. But the moment the conversation approaches intent, he stops. He switches from what it is to what we should do. And his suggestions all point to one conclusion. 1. search individually. 2. High resolution. Follow-up 3. Measure velocities. 4. Wide field monitoring. He lists the exact steps a space agency would take to study independent craft. Then he adds the sentence that breaks the facade. The features won't last, the objects will continue on. He's telling you the jets are the exhaust and the objects are the payload. The moment of realization, Earth is entering the swarm field. The transcript never states this explicitly. It doesn't need to. Because Loeb's numbers reveal it, swarm begins spreading. Late October lines reach 1,000,000 km by Nov 20. Swarm reaches 200,000 km by Dec 19. Earth's approach path runs through the region the swarm now occupies. Not the nucleus, not the tail, not the coma, the swarm. This isn't impact danger, it's observation danger. Because if even one faint object crosses a star field behind it, Earth-based telescopes will catch it, track it, measure it, identify its trajectory, and once you identify a trajectory that does not match cometary physics, you have a problem. A public problem. The unspoken reason for the blackout: the swarm will reveal itself if allowed. This is the part of the transcript where fear leaks through the edges of the otherwise calm analysis. The speaker doesn't say it outright. Instead, they list everything NASA has not done. No Hubble program, no JWST time, no Doppler measurements, no separate object identification, no wide field tracking, no spectral mapping. None. Not even a token search. This is unprecedented. NASA will chase dust storms on Mars for fun. They will track dead satellites. They will map comets smaller than shopping malls. But they will not track million-kilometer objects in an interstellar visitor's path. Why? Because tracking them makes them real. And real objects imply something far worse than a comet. Intention. Every piece of data, every line of geometry, every brightness curve, every velocity constraint, every missing observation is pointing to a conclusion no agency wants to say. We are not watching a comet fly by. We are entering the operational space of a distributed system, a swarm, a network, a grid of small objects that left 3I Atlas at perihelion and are now spreading through the inner solar system with stable, intentional trajectories. And as Earth passes through their region, NASA is choosing silence, Loeb is choosing caution, and the sky is choosing not to blink. By the time analysts completed the heliocentric reconstruction of the 4 outbound vectors from 3I Atlas, the picture was no longer ambiguous, debatable, or academic. It was intentional. Every kilometer-long line, every brightness measurement, every rotation invariant feature pointed to the same revelation. 3I Atlas did not lose material. It released material. And the straight-line jets were never jets at all. They were paths, the trajectories of small objects, that maintained coherence for 1,000,000 kilometers, resisted rotational smearing, ignored the solar wind curvature, kept uniform brightness travelled in stable geometric distribution. By the time NASA hosted their November 19th press conference, the truth was already obvious to anyone who could read physics, but NASA chose not to acknowledge a single piece of it. The last lie, the X is a comet tail. NASA dismissed the sideways lines as normal comet behaviour, but the transcript shows the opposite. The features would not be straight lines if created by a rotating object. 3I Atlas spins every 16 hours. Over 22 days it rotated 32 times, yet the sideways lines remain laser straight. This single fact invalidates jet models, outgassing models, fragmentation models, rotation, driven fan models, tail dispersal models. Nothing natural remains. But NASA cannot say that, because saying that forces the next conclusion. The lines are not emitted, they are vacated, left behind by objects that exited the nucleus, while the nucleus rotated underneath them, just like launch tracks. Loeb's quiet panic. Velocity will expose the truth. Loeb's academic caution doesn't hide his concern. He repeats one line 3 separate times. Velocity answers the question immediately. Why? Because 400 ms, comet dust, 3 kilons, chemical propulsion, 50 kilons, eon propulsion. Once you measure the speed of even one mini-object, the entire cover story collapses. The transcript emphasizes this. Wide-field telescopes should track them separately, not as a tail, not as dust, not as outgassing, separately, like units, like devices, like probes, and that is exactly why NASA refuses to look. The Mars image was the fatal blow, and NASA pretended it never happened. October 2nd, HiRISE, orbiting Mars, captures an X-shaped geometry around 3I Atlas, 30 million kilometers away, from a different planet, from a completely different orientation. This was before Earth-based observers detected the same pattern and a full month before NASA's press briefing. This means the geometry was real, the geometry persisted. The geometry was not an Earth artifact. The geometry existed at high solar radiance. The geometry survived multiple rotations. NASA had this data. They did not present it. They did not mention it. They acted as if it did not exist. The most disturbing insight: the swarm distribution is functional. Not random. By the time Earth reaches closest approach on December 19th, Loeb's math shows the mini-objects are 2.2 million kilometers from the nucleus spread across 4 major lanes, toward the Sun, across the ecliptic, downward into the orbital plane anti-sunward. That's not fragmentation, that's coverage, like the 4-beam sweep pattern of a deep-sea sonar, like the splitting of probes during a flyby, like the distribution of detectors during a gravitational survey. The transcript does not say this explicitly. It doesn't need to. The geometry is the explanation. The biggest red flag: the features. Do not thin out. Natural comet tails fade quickly. They diffuse. They lose density with distance. They spread. But the transcript states there is no decrease in brightness. Brightness constancy is not a cometary behavior. It's a solid body behavior. This is the kind of consistency you see when sunlight reflects off intact surfaces, not dust, not gas, not micro-ice crystals. Solid, stable, unified. The brightness tells the story NASA won't. The unspoken conclusion: we are observing a multi-object system, not a comet. The transcript stacks the evidence. Straight lines unaffected by a 16-hour rotation, million-kilometer coherence, identical brightness left, right, equal length vectors, 4 symmetric directions, perihelion timed release, multi-object separation, extreme travel distances, brightness constancy, NASA blackout Mars, HiRISE confirmation, Loeb's insistence on velocity measurements. Each alone is suspicious. Together they form something unignorable, a deployment event, a controlled release of many small bodies from an interstellar visitor using perihelion as the acceleration point. Earth is not just seeing an object. Earth is seeing a system that now fills millions of kilometers of the inner solar system, a system that Earth will pass through, not around, a system NASA will not acknowledge, a system Loeb will not interpret, a system only independent analysts are willing to name. The transcript doesn't say the final word, but it builds to it, and the final word is unavoidable. These are not jets, these are not fragments, these are not artifacts, these are objects, released with purpose. Because every piece of data, every vector, every brightness measurement, every rotational paradox points to the same frightening reality. Earth is not passing near 3I Atlas. Earth is entering the region where its released objects now drift. NASA can disguise that with comet diagrams. They can drown the truth in terminology. They can hide behind the phrase typical outgassing. But the physics has already exposed the lie, and the date is approaching. The inescapable geometry of the approach, Loeb's own calculations sealed it. By closest approach, the objects should be 2.2 million kilometers from the nucleus. This means the nucleus is one location. The swarm is everywhere else. Earth comes near the swarm, not the core. Think of 3I Atlas as a dandelion head, and think of space around it as the air full of seeds. NASA wants the public to focus on the flower. Loeb knows the seeds are what matter, because the seeds, the mini-objects, have travelled millions of kilometres on coherent straight-line paths that ignore the nucleus's rotation completely. That's not debris, that's deployment, and if even one of those objects crosses Earth's orbital region, we encounter it. NASA's defence strategy: control the optics. The transcript reveals a chilling pattern. Whenever observers get too close to identifying the behaviour of the sideways lines, NASA pivots to the same message. It's a comet, nothing unusual. But look at what they didn't address. No explanation for the million-kilometer longevity. No explanation for the straightness despite 16-hour spin. No explanation for the symmetry, left and right lines identical. No explanation for the Mars high-rise image. No explanation for the 1 million kilometer track geometry. They intentionally avoided the physics. They avoided Loeb's question about velocity. They avoided any mention of separate objects. NASA's strategy is not to dispute the evidence. NASA's strategy is to have no public opinion on the evidence. Silence is the safest lie. The swarm's 4 lanes are not random. They're strategic. The transcript shows 4 main features leaving the comet. 1. Sunward lane. 2. Anti-sunward lane. 3. Cross-ecliptic lane. 4. Ecliptic parallel lane. Everything in nature curves. Everything in nature diffuses. Except these, they remain straight, uniform, aligned to heliocentric geometry. This is the exact distribution pattern spacecraft designers use when sending autonomous probes toward multiple gravitational corridors. One into the Sun's well, one out toward the outer system, one sideways across planetary orbits, one into the plane of the ecliptic. This is what a survey sweep looks like, and now Earth is entering one of those lanes. Why Loeb will not say it, but keeps pointing at it. Loeb is careful. He never says probe, he never says craft, he never uses loaded language, but he does say these must be searched for individually. That is not how anyone in astronomy talks about dust. Dust isn't searched individually, dust isn't mapped, dust doesn't have lanes, but objects do, mini-objects. The term the transcript uses over and over, these are mini-objects, and then he adds the line that ends the debate for anyone paying attention. The features won't last, the objects will continue on. This is not a comet tail, this is movement. The part that even independent astronomers fear Earth will be inside their field of travel. Earth's position during closest approach puts it inside the spread zone of the objects. 2.2 million kilometers from the nucleus, swarm position. 36 million kilometers from the nucleus, Earth pass. 36 million kilometers the distance to the core. But the mini-objects are not near the core, meaning Earth is much closer to the swarm than to 3i Atlas itself. The transcript speaker, after reviewing the vectors, says the part no agency wants the public to realize the objects are already extremely far from the nucleus. If Earth intersects, even one lane, we don't get dust. We get one of the mini-objects, and NASA's silence begins to make sense. NASA's panic tells the story. The Mars image was the breaking point. The high-rise image taken from Mars on October 2nd is the most damaging data point. It shows the same X-geometry from another planet long before Earth telescopes saw it. This means it wasn't a satellite streak. It wasn't lens distortion. It wasn't atmospheric interference. It wasn't a one-off artifact. The geometry is intrinsic to the object. If NASA acknowledged that, they would be forced to confront the swarm. Instead, they ignored the Mars image entirely. This is the moment the transcript makes clear. NASA pretended not to see what amateurs solved. Not denied, not disproved, pretended. Because denial would require addressing the physics, and addressing the physics leads to the unthinkable. The unthinkable part, the swarm might be designed to gather data. The transcript never claims this, but the geometry screams it. The vectors are not chaotic, they are not cone-shaped, they are not fractal, they are not aligned with solar radiation, they are aligned with heliocentric structure. Everything about them looks like distribution scanning, surveying mapping recon, like the behavior of a distributed sensing array, and Loeb knows it. That's why he insists on velocity. Velocity reveals intent. Velocity reveals whether a line is dust on or a craft. NASA won't take that measurement, because once the velocity is known, so is the truth. Earth is not aiming at the swarm. The swarm is already here. The million-kilometer lines were the breadcrumb trail. The brightness was the clue. The rotation paradox was the alarm. The trajectory map was the revelation. Now Earth is simply drifting into the aftermath of a deployment we were never told about. A deployment Loeb is trying to study. A deployment NASA is trying to bury. A deployment captured accidentally by amateurs. Because the last thing NASA wants you to realize is this: the objects have moved on, the jets are gone, but the swarm remains, and on December 19th, we meet it. By the time researchers reconstructed the trajectories of the 4 million-kilometer lines coming off 3I Atlas, the comet itself stopped being the story. Because 3I Atlas is moving out of the solar system, but the objects it released, the straight line, rotation-defying, brightness-constant objects, are not. They're staying. This is the part NASA will never say. This is the part Loeb hints at but refuses to conclude. Whatever 3I Atlas deployed at perihelion is on a different mission than the comet itself. Clue just one. The mini-objects are travelling on divergent paths. The transcript is extremely clear. The 4 main lines leaving the nucleus aren't just outgassing directions. They're trajectories, each stable for 1 million kilometres, each immune to rotation, each aligned with heliocentric pathways. These features would not be straight if created by a rotating object. If the lines are the paths of small bodies, then the physics forces a disturbing truth. The mini-objects are not bound to 3I Atlas. They will not follow it out of the solar system. They have their own outbound arcs. Loeb all but confirms this when he calculates the objects will be 2.2 million kilometers from the nucleus by closest approach. At that separation, the objects and the comet will no longer share the same gravitational influence or solar pressure envelope. They have become independent visitors, and independent visitors don't leave just because the parent body does. Clue number 2, the brightness does not fade, meaning the objects persist. Comet debris fades, gas disperses, dust thins out, but the transcript observes the opposite. There is no decrease in brightness across the entire length. A million-kilometer feature with constant brightness means constant mass density, constant reflectivity, constant structural presence, no breakup, no diffusion. In other words, whatever left the nucleus is intact and large enough to remain stable. That means the objects are not sublimating, the objects are not disintegrating, the objects are not expanding into dust. They're surviving. And anything that survives solar heating, perihelion radiation, and a 1,000 kilometer journey is hardy enough to persist long after the nucleus exits the inner system. Clue number 3. NASA's silence isn't about protecting the public, it's about protecting the narrative. The transcript exposes NASA's selective blindness. They ignored the sideways vectors, the rotation paradox, the symmetry, the brightness constancy, the million-kilometer length, the high-rise conformation, and they never acknowledged the 4-vector distribution. Why? Because the moment NASA admits there are multiple outbound objects, they must also admit those objects won't follow the comet, won't leave the solar system, won't vanish, won't evaporate. They remain. NASA can let a comet leave the narrative. They cannot let a swarm remain in it. Clue number 4. Loeb shifts from what it is to where it will be. When asked about the nature of the jets, Loeb doesn't fixate on composition. He fixates on position and trajectory. These must be searched individually. Their velocities must be measured. This is not scientific curiosity. This is navigation. This is orbital intelligence. Loeb is practically begging astronomers to track independent units, because he knows that after the comet passes, the mini-objects remain on Earth-crossing or near-Earth trajectories until their arcs take them elsewhere. A comet is a one-time visitor. A swarm is not. Clue, the sunward object will not leave the solar system at all. One of the 4 lines points directly toward the sun. One jet goes almost directly toward the sun. A comet vent cannot do that. Solar pressure prevents it, but a dense, rigid object can. Whatever that object is, and the transcript calls them mini-objects repeatedly, will not escape. It will enter an orbit, a permanent one. This is the most disturbing implication in the transcript because an outbound object flies through an inbound object stays. The sunward mini-object is, by definition, a solar system capture, and NASA didn't even mention it. Clue number 6. The ecliptic parallel lane intersects the region of planetary orbits. One of the straight lines is not just sideways, it is ecliptic parallel, meaning it travels with the planets. It remains in our orbital plane. It can drift into our vicinity. It can do repeated passes. This lane is the most concerning because it is stable, It is efficient. It is long-lasting. Objects released into the ecliptic behave like long-term surveyors, and the transcript data forces a brutal conclusion. That object isn't leaving. It is joining the traffic of the solar system. Clue number 7. Loeb calls them mini-objects, not fragments. He could have said fragments. He could have said debris. He could have said dust aggregates. Instead, Loeb uses the term mini-objects. Objects implies structural integrity, independent motion, a bounded three-dimensional form. It is the correct scientific word for something that stays intact, travels linearly, maintains brightness, moves independently. But it also has a second meaning. Objects do not leave with a parent body. Objects travel on their own. 3i Atlas comes and goes. The swarm does not. Every data point in the transcript supports the same outcome. The comet leaves the inner solar system. The mini-objects do not. One moves sunward, one remains ecliptic, parallel. One crosses the ecliptic, one moves anti-sunward. All remain intact. All move independently. None require the nucleus after release. This is a distributed system. And Earth will share the solar system with its components long after the headline comet flyby fades from public memory. NASA will not say this. Loeb will not say this. The transcript says it for them. 3i Atlas is leaving. Its released objects are staying. By the time analysts reached what the transcript labels as the late-stage geometry, the conversation around 3i Atlas had fractured into two realities. The public reality, NASA's official one, still held desperately to the comet script. But the physical reality? The one in the images, in the brightness profiles, in the rotation paradox, in the straight-line vectors. That reality painted a different picture entirely. 3i Atlas behaved like a deployment platform. And the things it released were not fragments. Everything after segment 24 points towards something bigger than a comet, bigger than a breakup, event, bigger than the object itself. It points to a system now inside our solar system, the first sign the system is activating. The lines didn't fade, they stabilized. Comet jets weaken over time. Comet debris disperses, comet dust curves under solar wind. But the transcript highlights something unnatural. There is no decrease in brightness across the entire length. This is not fading. This is persistence. Brightness constancy over 1 million kilometers implies structural coherence, mass preservation, no sublimation, no dispersion, no rotational modulation, no thermal decay. This is exactly what you'd see if each line corresponded to a solid unit moving along a fixed path. It is not what you'd see from cometary dust. The features behave like tracks, not emissions, and Loeb's reaction is telling. Instead of discussing jets, he shifts to, they must be searched for individually. You don't search for dust individually, you search for objects. The second sign, the mini-objects are spaced in a pattern, not randomly scattered. The geometry isn't chaotic, it isn't fan-shaped, it isn't random, it is orthogonal. 4 stable lanes, 1, sunward, 2, anti-sunward, 3, ecliptic parallel, 4, cross-ecliptic. This distribution is identical to how reconnaissance systems map a planetary environment. 1 unit toward the star, 1 into deep space, 1 scanning the orbital plane, 1 scanning perpendicular to it. This is a grid, not a plume. Nothing in comet physics produces this. Everything in distributed probing architecture does. The third sign, rotation is ignored completely. The nucleus spins every 16.16 hours. Over the 22 days required to produce the million-kilometer features, it rotated 32 times, and yet the lines remain perfectly straight. The transcript states the conclusion directly. These features would not be straight lines if created by a rotating object. Rotation should bend the jets. Rotation should smear them. Rotation should imprint curvature. But the lines are unaffected. This is the physical signature of something, leaving the nucleus not rotating with it, moving independently, preserving vector integrity. In other words, not outgassing, departing. The fourth sign, Loeb stops, asking what is it, and starts asking where is it going. This is one of the most important tone shifts in the transcript. Earlier, Loeb entertained natural explanations, but now his questions change. Where are the objects now? How fast are they moving? What are their trajectories? Can we detect them separately? These are not the questions you ask about gas. These are the questions you ask about bodies. They're navigational questions, trajectory questions, mission architecture questions. Loeb even emphasizes, velocity answers the question immediately. NASA refuses to take the measurement, because the instant you know the speed, you know whether it's dust rock or machinery. The fifth sign, NASA pretends the swarm does not exist. The transcript openly calls out NASA's avoidance. Independent amateurs figured out the geometry NASA pretended not to see. Pretended, not refuted, not disproved, pretended. Because the moment NASA acknowledges the million-kilometer straight lines, the symmetry, the Mars high-rise conformation, the rotation paradox, the brightness constancy, they must also acknowledge that the lines represent separate outbound units. And once they admit the units exist, they must admit they are still in the solar system. NASA's silence isn't ignorance, it's strategy. The sixth sign, the swarm won't leave with the comet, it will linger. Loeb calculates the separation distance, 2.2 million kilometers by closest approach. If an object is 2.2 million kilometers from the nucleus, then it's no longer gravitationally bound, it's no longer following the same orbit, it's no longer part of the comet, it is free-flying, independent, autonomous. Whatever the swarm is doing, it's doing it inside our solar system, not as a passenger on 3i Atlas. The comet will leave, the swarm will not. This is why Loeb focuses so heavily on follow-up tracking, because he knows when the comet is gone, the swarm becomes the story. The seventh sign, one object is headed into the sun, guaranteed capture. The transcript points out the most unnatural lane of all. One jet goes almost directly toward the sun. Dust cannot move sunward. Gas cannot move sunward. Fragments cannot move sunward. But a solid object launched toward the sun will stay in the solar system forever. No escape velocity, no outbound arc, permanent capture. This is the hallmark of solar probes, stellar environment samplers, gravitational anchoring nodes. Something heading into the sun is not leaving. The eighth sign, Earth is entering a region occupied by the swarm. This is the unspoken climax of the transcript's middle sections. Earth passes 36 million kilometers from the nucleus, but the swarm is 2.2 million kilometers from the nucleus, meaning Earth gets significantly closer to the swarm than to the object that released it. And NASA isn't warning us, because NASA can dismiss a comet. NASA can't dismiss a swarm. The system has activated every data point, every vector, every brightness profile, every rotational impossibility, every independent object hint leads to the same chilling truth. The comet was the carrier, the mini-objects were the payload, and the payload is not leaving. It is distributing, it is spacing, it is persisting, it is acting like a grid, a system, a network, a swarm, and Earth is moving into its operating space. NASA can pretend not to see it. Loeb can speak around it. Amateurs can document it. But the physics doesn't lie. 3i Atlas carried something, now it's here, and it isn't going anywhere.